What is going on, guys? Max Settings here, and welcome back to another review. In today's review, we are going to be comparing the Schiit Asgard 3 versus the HeadAmp Gilmore Lite MK2. Now, before we hop on into today's review, I just have to give a shout out to the two different viewers who provided both of these amps for review and comparison. And I will be returning both of these back to their owners when I am done, but thanks again to them for providing these for review. But anyway, the Schiit Asgard 3 and the HeadAmp Gilmore Lite MK2 both come in at a fairly different price bracket. The Asgard 3 is $199 and the Gilmore Lite MK2 is $499. Now, the reason I'm comparing them today is because they are both technically Class A amplifiers. The Gilmore Lite MK2 is fully Class A. The Asgard 3 is Schiit's continuity amplification, which is their Schiit's new amplification tech that runs a very high amount of Class A bias, but then once you pass that, it switches to another amplification class for the rest of the power needed. It's kind of a complicated thing, but you can read about it on their site. But because both of these amps are Class A and made in America, I figured that they would be a good thing to compare to each other, and we will see which one of these I prefer. But let's go ahead and get specs out of the way, and I'm only going to do I'm realistically only going to do power specs on these because if we go through THD, whatever, it's going to take forever. It's going to be boring. So the Asgard 3, you get 5 watts at 16 ohms, 3.5 watts at 32 ohms, 2.5 watts at 50 ohms, 600 milliwatts at 300 ohms, and 300 milliwatts at 600 ohms. And you get about 500 milliwatts of Class A before it switches over to the other amplification mode. So about half a watt of fully Class A power. Now, the Gilmore Lite only gives max power of 1.5 watts, and I believe that's at 32 ohms, might be at 16, but most people will quote it at 32, so that would be my guess. However, this one is fully Class A as opposed to the continuity on the Asgard 3 here. And the Asgard 3 on paper has a little bit lower output impedance, about 0.2 ohms versus roughly 1 on the Gilmore here. Okay, so now let's go over the physical overview of both of these units. So the Asgard 3 is fairly typical for a Schiit amplifier, the standard Schiit metal body. And this one is black, but it's also offered in silver. You have the fairly standard Schiit volume knob, 2 switches on the front, a high-low gain, which is unusual to see for a Schiit product to have a high-low gain switch on the front. A lot of theirs have them on the back, but I guess most of their modern ones now have them on the front. I'm reminiscing of my Valhalla 2 that used to have it on the back. And this switch here is if you get this with a built-in DAC module, which this particular unit is not optioned with, but you can get either a AK4490 DAC or a multi-bit DAC integrated into this unit, and it becomes an all-in-one. And if you want to have it use the internal DAC, you have it up there. And then standard 1/4-inch output. Now of note, I would actually recommend you skip the internal module and just get a MODI, but it's up to you. This is where the module would go if you had it installed, but again, this one does not. RCA inputs, RCA preamps, and these mute when you plug in the headphone. Power switch and a power plug, so just a standard power plug on the back. And that is the overview of the Asgard 3. Now moving on to the Gilmore here. This is made by HeadAmp, which of note is actually fairly local to me. They're about, I think about a 2-hour drive from where I live. Now this is a little bit more rudimentary looking of a metal box, and this is the newest revision that has the white logo and a white light. I think the slightly older revisions had like a gold logo with a amber LED. But on the front you have a 1/4-inch output, a glossy plastic volume knob with a little white dot indicator and some little white check marks for the volume. Feels very nice, very smooth. You have a white LED, the input switch, input 1, input 2, because this amp does have 2 inputs on the back. But before we go to the back, just big rubber feet on the bottom, and the amp is not very heavy. It definitely weighs less than the Asgard does. So 2 sets of RCA inputs, and then a pre-out switch that is selectable. You can turn it on and off with this switch here, which is quite nice. A 6-pin power input, so it has a little bit weird of a power plug, not just a standard plug. And then you have power on off switch on the back. So that is the overview of the Gilmore. Okay, so now how this testing was conducted. So what I did for my testing was I fed the RCAs out of my Cambridge 851D DAC into this RCA switcher. Now this switcher is initially meant for you to feed 2 things in and allow you to switch both of them to an output. However, you can run these in reverse. So you can feed one in and have it switch between 2 different outs. So what was done was the 851D fed RCA in, and then 2 different RCA outs were fed to both of the amps. And then on the front, I can switch which amp the DAC is outputting to with a push of a button like so. So that is how I did the testing for this review. And what I found is that I greatly prefer the sound of the Asgard 3 versus the Gilmore. Now I used the HD800 and the headphone, the HEDD phone for this testing because HD800 is very source revealing, and the headphone is very hard to drive, so I figured I'd put both of these to their limits in terms of output power. And both of these actually managed to drive it very well, except all in like maybe 1 or 2 very, very lowly mastered classical songs, which I was very surprised that I could max this out with 2.5 watts at around 50 ohms, which is what the headphone is. But for 99.99% of stuff, both of these will power the headphone, just of note. But anyway, so the Gilmore sounds a lot more compressed. It doesn't sound dead, but it doesn't have as much of dynamic range. Everything sounds much more pushed together in terms of volume. And it also just nuked the stage on the HD800, where, you know, the Asgard had, you know, the classic HD800 stage where everything's out here. And in the Gilmore, it sounds like it goes from here to like here. It just moves very inward and much less dynamic contrast, both micro and macro dynamic contrast. Again, not to the point where it sounded like mega dead, but just where everything just sounded kind of squashed together, much more compressed stage and much less dynamic contrast. In terms of like detail, it still sounds fairly detailed, and I think it's faking some of its detail too, just because of the compression makes stuff sound louder, so you hear it more prevalently. But it still sounds fairly detailed overall. The Asgard 3 has a little bit of that shit glare, but nothing too bad. Not like as much as like the older Jotunheims were. But the Asgard 3 sounds really good for $200. Like shockingly good. This sounds like a much more expensive amplifier than it is. And honestly, I think it sounds better than some of the THX amps in this price point. It sounds a little bit less compressed overall than some of the THX amps. So I think this should be one that a lot of people are looking at, because this thing sounds really nice for the money. Good staging, good overall dynamic contrast, sounds very detailed, not overly colored, fairly black background if we're going to go on that old John Darko terminology. And overall, yeah, the Asgard 3 is a bang for the buck for the price point. I could definitely see paying $100 for this over the Madi. It sounds a decent bit wider than I remember. I haven't heard the 3 Plus outside of show settings, but the 3 had a little bit more of a compressed stage, where this sounds not as squished in as the Magni 3 did. So again, I could definitely see paying double over the Magni for this. But Asgard 3, really, really good for the price, and I do recommend it. Gilmore's an interesting thing. Maybe for some headphones, it would be kind of like a flavor amp. But overall, not my favorite thing in terms of sound, which is a shame, because I do like to support local companies when I can. But Not my favorite thing in terms of sound. There was like one or two songs on the headphone that, for some whatever reason, I thought the compression just made sound better, but they were kind of poorly mastered, so maybe that's why. But this one may be worth a try if you can pick up a used one, but I think the Asgard 3 overall sounds better. And honestly, I'm almost thinking about offering to buy it off of the owner, because I do quite like it. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the review and comparison of the Asgard 3 and the Gilmore Lite Mark II. Links of where to buy both of these in the description below, as well as my Twitter, my contact email, and all other relevant information. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the review. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.